Muqawqis and those people who ruled in Egypt at the time, um, that when they saw Ubadah, they said, "Get this black man away from me." Those people who were ruling Egypt at the time of the Islamic conquest were not the followers of Imhotep. They were not
Yes.
the ones who were, they were not the ones who were ruling Egypt at the time. So it was actually, it was the Byzantine Empire, which held its roots within Eastern Europe at the time, Western Eastern Europe and European tradition. They were the ones who had occupied Egypt at the time, not the followers of Imhotep. Who, in fact, you sometimes even find in history discussions, and as one sort of the topic as well, I find even discussions. I was, like Tariq bin Ziyad, Azirikli, and Maqarri, Tilimsani, for instance, they held that Tariq bin Ziyad was an Arab. You do find similar narratives in North Africa. There are some Amazigh who don't really want anything to do with Islam or anything to do with kind of Arabs or anything to do with Arabic. That's really strong in parts of North Africa as well. It has to be said. And it's interesting sometimes as well that sometimes the core arguments are the same, whether that's from maybe some of the Afrocentrics, whether that's from some of the Persian nationalists, whether that's we hear that from people that sort of the Hindu and Indian nationalists, or whether that's from the Amazigh nationalists. The kind of core thing is the same. People who have their own sort of ill intentions, the people who are not honest, the people who are not impartial in their research and in their writing, they only show kind of one side. They're not impartial in their writing or in their historiography, and that's really important as well. This is something which has been documented as well. By the scholars in the past who wrote about history, like Imam Suyuti, for instance. He also mentions this about the benefits in history as well, that you learn lessons from history. So you don't want to become someone. We don't want to be people who hide history or embellish history or present history in a certain light, which is only, supporting kind of one particular people over another people.
Assalamu alaikum, Ustad AbdulHaq Al-Ashanti. It's actually a very, very special occasion to have someone of your caliber on this platform. Your work in the field of literature, Islamic literature, translations, original works, has actually captivated many of us who are into the field of Islamic history. So it's a delight to have you on this platform, especially today, discussing the issue of historiography within the Islamic tradition. So before I continue, can you please introduce yourself for those of us who may not yet be familiar with your work, and tell us a bit more about yourself.
بسم الله إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So indeed all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, we ask for His forgiveness. Whomsoever Allah guides, there's none to misguide, and whomever Allah misguides, there's none to guide. I bear witness that there's no God worthy of worship except Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the servant and final messenger of Allah. And to proceed, so I'm your brother, the one who's in need of Allah's aid, AbdulHaq, the son of Kofi, the son of Kwesi, originally from the tribe of Al-Ashanti in what became known as Ghana. So that's me, and I was born in Oxford. And my parents are originally from Ghana, and I became Muslim in 1994. So when I was about 17 years of age, I became Muslim, and then I did my higher level studies. I didn't actually do that good at school, to be honest. Like secondary school, in particular, I didn't really do that well. However, one thing I was really good at an early age was that I had an advanced reading level for my age, and then so later on, after kind of teenage years, then after sort of more deep reflection upon sort of life and so forth, I became Muslim when I was 17 years of age, and then I kind of went back to education, went back to my studies, and then eventually got accepted into SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, in 1997, where I started my BA in history, specializing in African history, and then in 2000 I then did my MA in the history of Islam in Africa. And then
MashaAllah.
I also did Arabic for about a year at university, and then private study for Arabic, um, and from about the sort of late 90s, completed some like Al-Ajrumiyah in like 1998 with a teacher. And I've been sort of traveling as well. Met some sort of scholars, largely linked to the madrasa of like Imam Al-Albani, his students, in Jordan, and sort of benefited a lot from the scholars there in Jordan, the students of Al-Albani, and also some other mashaykh who I've had the pleasure to meet as well over the last sort of 20, 25 years as well, and benefited from them on their visits. And I've lived in sort of Saudi Arabia for a year. And when I lived in Saudi Arabia, I actually contributed to an Islamic studies curriculum project, which has been since been published. Yeah.
And you are the author of a very special book, if you would like to introduce that book to us, inshallah.
So I'm the author of the book Defining Legends, which some people would describe as sort of my magnum opus. Defining Legends actually first began that when I was at university. So like in 1999, I'd say that's when I first started it. And I was actually going to, so since then, so I was actually kind of contributing bits, and things I was coming across, I was kind of doing bits of research and adding, contributing to it and stuff like that. I did actually do like a sort of an independent 50-page version, like about 20 years ago of that. But as I said, since then, that's been adding and amending to it because the topic was something which really interested me. When I first became Muslim, I used to read a lot of books by some of the all sorts of books that relate to history, African history, Black history, and I came across a lot of the works by some of the kind of Afrocentric writers at the time, so sort of in the 90s. But at the same time, though, what I noticed, which kind of spurred my interest to do more research, was how that they were very kind of critical of Islam, and maybe they were in within, but they maybe felt they were in reason to do that. But that sparked my interest to do more research and to investigate more and explore more with regards to some of the things that they were saying about Islam, and to see if it was credible, particularly with regards to the history of Islam and how it spread in Africa, and also what that kind of meant for people of the African diaspora. And that's kind of what really sort of spurred my interest. And since then, so since then I was kind of contributing to it, adding different bits and things I was coming across, adding to it. And then it's culminated into a book which is about 400 pages, and one of the brothers, Jazakallah khair, he contacted me about it in 2018, and he was aware that I did have this research, and he said, yeah, well, I'll be happy to publish it. So alhamdulillah. So that was
MashaAllah. That's a wonderful
I mean, to be
intersection.
honest, the current the version which is available, I mean, there are still some sort of typos. Maybe if Allah makes it easy, could do like a second edition of it. I think that would be needed. But yeah, there are some sort of typo errors in parts of the book.
That's not a problem at all. No work is perfect other than the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But I think the intersection between history, African history, Islamic history, is very interesting because there are many misconceptions that are oftentimes peddled and pushed forward as facts, especially when it comes to Islam in Africa and that dynamic there. There's so much, and everyone has their own perspective, but also intention behind why they push a certain narrative behind that. As a historian, somebody who studied history, somebody who's involved in the literature of history and writing historiography, how do you think the tradition within Islam actually differs from what, for example, let's say a strictly Afrocentric perspective? What are the defining critical factors for a Muslim historian in writing, researching, and delving into that? Give us a bit of an insight, inshallah.
That's an excellent question to start off with, to be honest. I mean, first of all, the Islamic tradition, especially the scholarly tradition, has to be something which is based upon. It's not based upon emotion. So it has to be based upon the the strong evidence, strongly hinged upon the evidence's impartiality. And I think sometimes we forget that, you know. Some of the scholars, there's a well-known statement as well, which I wanted to mention, which was one of the how some of the scholars of Islam, particularly the scholars of the Sunnah and Ahl Sunnah, Ahl Hadith, they mention how the people of knowledge, Ahl al-Ilm, uh, they Ahl al-Ilm yaktubuna ma lahum wa ma alayhim. So the people of the Hadith and the people of Sunnah, they write and they author that which is for them, but also that which is against them. Which some of the scholars mentioned, badalan min ahl al-hawa alladhina yaktubuna faqad lahum. Except for the people of desire, who only write those things which are for them, only those things which are aid them. And that's not, and this is whereas Sheikh Al-Albani, he also mentioned as well how the people of the truth, Ahl al-Haq, that they write, that they mention يذكر الحقائق سواء كانت لهم أو عليهم. You mentioned that the people of truth, they write that which is for them or against them, as opposed to the way of the people of desire. So it shows then that the people who have their own sort of ill intentions, the people who are not honest, the people who are not impartial in their research and in their writing, they only they only show kind of one side. They're not impartial in their writing or in their historiography, and that's really important as well. You know, and this is something which has been documented as well, you know, by the scholars in the past who wrote about history, like Imam Suyuti, for instance. He also mentions this about the benefits in history as well, that you learn lessons from history. So you don't want to become someone, you know, we don't want to be people who hide history or embellish history or you know, present history in a certain light, which is only, you know, supporting kind of one particular people over another people. These kind of things are really important as well, that in the Islamic tradition, that this was emphasized by many of the scholars of the past as well. So that's something that are really important things to mention when it comes to kind of historiography and sort of writing biographies and so forth. And this is also the way of the people of Hadith as well. That how would you know that a trustworthy narrator is that they look at, you know, was the narrator someone who was someone who you know, was the person trustworthy, and things like whether the person lied and so forth. All of these things are, you know, contribute to that, which shows the kind of the due diligence which was shown by many of the scholars of Hadith in the past. And this is something which is unrivaled actually across civilizations when you think about it, where there's this kind of critical assessment of you know, those people who are kind of in the chains of narration, who have transmitted the knowledge and kind of assessing that. So I think that is kind of like I think the first kind of introductory thing to mention. I think when we're looking at this, it's really important. Just as well as not just Imam Suyuti also covered this, but also like Imam Sakhawi as well. He's got a landmark book on historiography called Al-I'lan bit-Tawbiq liman dhamm Ahl al-Tarikh, which is called Al-I'lan bit-Tawbiq, which is like alerting and informing and admonishing, alerting the admonition of those people who censure the people of history. That's really important. So again, Sakhawi discusses the importance of history. Also, Subki as well in Tabaqat al-Kubra. He mentions in the biography of Ahmed bin Salih al-Misri that historians can possibly debase a people or raise a people due to asab or jahl, or merely due to relying on a transmission of someone who cannot be trustworthy. So all of these things are really important, I think, you know, when we're kind of looking at kind of historiography and what the Islamic tradition of history and where that stems from, because it essentially does stem from the diligence and the scholarship of largely the scholars of Hadith, and I think sometimes that kind of can get lost. So that's really important, I think, as well.
I think perfectly, and I think it's great to have this also critical spirit within us. As you said, that not only do we disclose what is for us, but also what is against us. And that's the Islamic spirit of قُلُوا الْحَقَّ وَلَوْ عَلَى أَنفُسِكُمْ. Even when something is against you, but the truth is always primary. So in that pursuit of truth, sometimes we look at the books of history, there are less than flattering accounts, but it should still be studied. It should be part of the narrative. Not just that we only show what is good and what is praiseworthy and hide everything else. It is a balancing act, and I think it does a great deal of service for the Muslim especially to be able to read these books and to look at history, but also to not only celebrate the highlights, but also learn from the errors of the past so we don't have to repeat the same errors again, yes. But having said that, there is a distinction between, you mentioned many times Ahlul Hadith, there is a distinction between Ahlul Hadith and Ahlul Khabar, Akhbar, the historians effectively. And I believe the title you just mentioned now from As-Subki is effectively a way of almost advocating on behalf of the historians. What's the distinction between history and hadith? Just for somebody who doesn't know anything whatsoever, what would be the difference? How would you describe that difference?
That's a good point. There some of the scholars they have mentioned, they have discussed that actually. And Sheikh Sheikh Salih al-Sheikh, he delivered a lecture actually, which I translated on principles for understanding the seerah. And in there, he mentioned some good points with regards to there is as you correctly mentioned, that sometimes the standards by which seerah is accepted is not the same as the high standard to which necessarily hadith is accepted. And as a result of that, we do find sort of fabricated stories, even things in history as well. Actually, a kind of sometimes we find that there's also there's difference. There's sometimes things which are, not there's not the same maybe diligence in kind of ascertaining some of those trains as in hadith. So you're right, you are right there, and that we do find that. So as we find seerah, there's a lot of accounts and which are not authentic, which people do think are authentic, but in fact they're not. There are some of the tabaqat works, for instance, contain things which are not authentic, and that's due to some of the as you said, the processes of ascertaining some of the chains are not to the same standard as hadith. And you find things like that in history. In fact, you sometimes even find in history discussions, and as one that's sort of the topic as well. I find even discussions. I was, like Tariq bin Ziyad, who, in fact, there's actually difference of opinion actually as to was he Amazigh? Was he Amazigh from North Africa, or was he an Arab? And some of the scholars, like Az-Zirikli and Al-Maqarri, At-Tilimasani, for instance, they held that Tariq bin Ziyad was an Arab. But then some of the scholars like Al-Idrisi, Ibn Khalikan and Ibn al-Adari, they held that no, in fact, Tariq bin Ziyad was Amazigh. So things like that, you find like there's like you would think that it would just surely that it was kind of sort of well known as to what his ethnicity was. But see, even that there's a discussion kind of shows that it's sometimes the same rigor is not necessarily followed throughout when in history and in the historical works.
And having said that, I know the barriers to entry are far lower when it comes to Tariq compared to Hadith. Is heaven and earth effectively. There's no comparison in terms of rigor, in terms of discipline, in terms of even just being able to say you're part of the equation. Somebody who's, there's a lot of a difference there. But there is still a very beneficial element to history, to learning history, which is attested to by the fact that we have so many books on history. Tariq al-Islam, every other scholar has written one. Al-Bidaya wa Nihaya, so many of them.
But as well, I think though we could safely sort of safely say that I think there are some particular scholars from the Islamic tradition who we would probably feel more content with reading their historical works, because we know that there'll be more criticism, and we see that sometimes, like in some of the works like Imam al-Dhahabi and Ibn Kathir. There's more critical discussion sometimes in some of the like chains of narration that they bring, and I think so which is good, which shows that they kind of merged between trying to use this kind of systematic critical method of the scholars of hadith, but at the same time, relaying some of the historical events which happened in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I find it's very fascinating. A book that I always mention is Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah. I find it to be very methodical and very, very precise in how he basically tries to lay out a school of thought for historiography within the Islamic tradition. And he's very critical of those who come before him. Al-Mas'udi, for example, is constantly being criticized, but
Problems with Al-Mas'udi, yeah. There are problems with Al-Mas'udi, yeah.
and others. But it's great because what I find in that is that there is an opportunity for us to use agency and to think beyond just the reading of text. Do you actually have critical faculties that you can exercise now? Because in Hadith and in Aqidah and really Islamic studies, you cannot use that. It's bridled, isn't it? You can't use your mind because this is text based on revelation. But historiography is not revelation. And therefore there is a potential now to actually exercise critical thinking, to do comparative reading, to really engage the senses, because it doesn't ascend to the level of revelation. So I find it very, very important that we engage with the historiography of the Muslim past. With that in mind, we have the agency to actually think and to critically analyze and assess. But it does cause some confusion, I think, that oftentimes, for example, we may come across a narration in Ibn Kathir, Bidayah wa Nihaya, or At-Tabari, that can cause problems because, again, not everybody compiled based on authenticity. Sometimes it is compiled because it's a mu'jam, just to compile. And it can cause confusion. You know, certain passages, certain histories, certain elements are disturbing to the modern reader. How would you advise we get over that? What's the method by which you can avoid this pitfall in just believing everything you read in the books of Tariq?
Yeah, good question. I think it's quite, to be honest, some of these things are quite, I mean, I think it's important to maintain that kind of level of criticism and level of kind of inquiry about what you're reading, and also looking at, but whatever you're reading, is there further elaboration in kind of in sort of obviously in the past they used to be in the hawamish, the marginal notes. Nowadays in sort of in that you have the footnotes. Is there greater elaboration in some of the notes? I know some people sometimes complain about, oh, read this book, and it's something which I do myself. But I do is I do use copious footnotes. But I use copious footnotes because it's for to help myself as well, and also the reader, if they want to kind of look at further research and further investigation in some of the points. I think it can't just it's not if. And I think sometimes I think one of the disservices is just to the way of the kind of the way of the people of Hadith, and what is sometimes known as today as the Salafi tradition. One of the services is that there's until when there was this emphasis on the evidence and where the sources and that kind of thing, people just writing anything in books.
That's it, yeah.
And I think so, but prior to kind of this emphasis on what's the adilla, what's the evidence, what's the proof, where's this from? I think that's been something really important in more the kind of contemporary area in terms of kind of knowledge. Although some could be argued that this was also there in the past, but that was kind of more kind of restricted to kind of mainly the scholars. But now there is more critical kind of assessment. Hold on, where's that from? What's the source? What's the discussion upon that? And it's not just kind of you just have the scholar and the kind of there's it's not necessarily the case that it's just the dichotomy is just you have the alim and you have the muqallid or the ammi. There is sometimes also, as some scholars mention, there is kind of also a median way as well, where there are those people who are kind of able to also do have a degree of kind of critical analysis and can do a little bit of reading and research and that kind of thing, and and follow kind of based upon what upon evidence which is clear to them, and also based upon what they're discussing with people who are more knowledgeable. But that's really important as well. And I think essentially all of this is really important when we're looking at history, is because of the kind of huge claims, which sometimes, and I think that's kind of leads us to what we're going to be discussing today, is some of the really dangerous and sort of falsehoods which people regurgitate, which people sort of take as history. When you investigate further, it's actually not the history at all. And that's kind of led me to kind of like to author defining legends and some of the things I was hearing and reading, and some of the really kind of wild claims and um, assertions which happened regards to particularly how Islam spread in Africa.
In West Africa specifically, or East Africa? 'Cause we get a lot of
All of Africa. If you look at if you look at kind of which kind of I think this is a nice segue into the kind of topic, is like if we sort of spend a few minutes looking at kind of but how did Islam arrive in Africa? And when we think about it, I'd say many kind of non-Muslims are totally unbeknown as to, except for obviously those people who this is their specialization, or they have some kind of basis in history. It's really not clear to them actually as to how Islam even spread in Africa. There's still you still find the suggestion that Islam was spread by force and by the sword, and it's really kind of disappointing to see people from the African diaspora also following down that train of thought as well. But and I've seen this in the book, and I think one of the books which is really pivotal in this is the book by Chancellor Williams, which is called The Destruction of Black Civilization, which features on the cover an Arab on horseback with a sword fighting a semi-naked African tribesman with a spear. The image itself as well kind of is something which is based upon kind of a stereotypical like Eurocentric images of both peoples, but something like that is that's really kind of have to be careful. Did anything like that actually occur? And when you actually look at in the history of Islam, which is really important as well as good as an introduction to this, is that there was no definitely when we're looking at kind of what is known as Black Africa, there was no kind of expedition by Arabs by force to spread Islam. In fact, when we look, what was the relationship between Africa and Islam anyway? The first thing was the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned to the Sahaba that he should, in fact, go to Habasha, go to Ethiopia, because there's a righteous king who doesn't oppress anyone. So Africa was actually key and pivotal in aiding the first Muslims and aiding Islam, granting safe haven to the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is usually denied. We never find this in the books of many of the people of the books of some of the well-known Afrocentrics. They don't mention that, or even some of the people who have their own maybe axis to grind, like people who, like as mentioned, like Chancellor Williams and others. Chancellor Williams was actually a very strong Christian missionary, again, which is unbeknown to many. So which maybe demonstrates why he had some of his own aspersions against Islam. There's also a book as well by John Allen Bella Azuma as well, which talks about which I think he called like Arab Islam in Africa or something along thereabouts. Again, regurgitates another Christian missionary, regurgitates some of these really kind of totally erroneous things that he mentioned about the spread of Islam. So it's really important that we understand, okay, how did Islam spread in this part in this part of Africa? And when we actually look at it, there was actually no kind of wholesale expedition by Arabs into like Africa in that manner. None whatsoever. Now, North Africa, that's a different thing. If we're going to talk about North Africa,
North Africa,
and some of the Amazigh tribes in North Africa, okay. But even like if we to look into Nubia, for instance, which I think is key, there were some skirmishes during the time of like Uqba bin Nafi', radiallahu anh. There were some skirmishes, but there was no major kind of even battle. I don't think. I think there was like a small battle, but nothing. I don't even think there was many casualties in that. And all of this is very interesting. The Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned in Hadith about that you should leave اتركوا أهل الحبشة لو تركوكم. Leave the people of Ethiopia so long as they leave you. And that's why we can see that that this was something which there was no, and Ethiopia, as you've kind of as well, you've really superbly illustrated in many of your work as well. There was no kind of, some of these nations, they weren't actually colonized at all. Was that maybe something to do with maybe Allahu Alam, maybe that was to do with what Allah gave to them, but what they did to protect and grant safe haven to Islam, to the Muslims, is that Allah.
That's a wonderful correlation. I never thought of that before. Actually, you're right, because Ethiopia is I think the only African nation that wasn't colonized, at least in the way others and was the only African country that actually defeated the colonizer at the Battle of Adwa. So it's a great connection there.
Also, we discussed Ethiopia and its role in early Islam. We will also discuss about Nubia, that because there were some Christian kingdoms in Nubia, but there was no kind of wholesale destruction or scorched earth policy or anything which the early Muslims did. So that's clear. And another key point which I want to mention before we kind of move on to the main topic is the role of is the conquest of Egypt. Fath al-Misr. That's really important in this kind of discussion about, because Egypt has been something which has been used by some people who do adhere to kind of the Afrocentric concepts, that in somehow Arabs came and overran the civilization of ancient Egypt, and and it's really important because and one of the things which is key here, which is a narration which is mentioned by Ibn AbdulHaq in his book Futuh al-Misr wa Akhbaruha, the conquest of Egypt and its reports. And he mentions about how when the Muslims conquered Egypt, and that there was that the delegation of Muslims went to see Al-Muqawqis. I mean,
Caucasus,
it's
yeah.
interesting.
Yes.
Muqawqis, interesting. Some of the scholars mention Muqawqis. It derives from the Greek word Pekaukasos, which means Caucasian. But
Okay.
interesting, and because there were Caucasians, people from the Caucasus region who were in the Sassanid Empire. In any case, when the delegation of Muslims led by Ubadah ibn al-Samit, radiallahu anhu,
Right.
when he went to see Muqawqis and those people who were ruling Egypt at the time, um, that when they saw Ubadah, they said, "Get this black man away from me." This is related by Ibn Abdul
Mm.
in the 9th century Christian era, in his book Futuh al-Misr, the conquest of Egypt. And Ubadah said to him in reply, well, there are 1,000 men who are blacker than me, more ferocious than me, waiting outside. So which is interesting, because I think on this point, Ustad Ibrahim, really important. I think there's a number of lessons here. Because I think in this kind of dialogue which ensued, it said that Abu Amr ibn al-As, he said that although he is black, he has got seniority amongst us. He has got prominence among us. So all of these things show that, first of all, that blackness among the first Muslims was not something which was denigrated. It shows that there was a meritocracy in early Islam. It shows that as well, that that Islam didn't have any kind of thing. There was no kind of anything based upon one's color or complexion in terms of the position which one's had. But key as well, it also showed that those people who were ruling Egypt at the time of the Islamic conquest were not the followers of Imhotep. They were not
Yes.
the ones who they were not the ones who were ruling Egypt at the time. So it was actually, it was the Byzantine. It was a Byzantine Empire, which held its roots within Eastern Europe at the time, Western Eastern European tradition. They were the ones who had occupied Egypt at the time, not the followers of Imhotep, who had long gone. So I think there's things like that which are not kind of adequately assessed by some of the people. They have which kind of, and to be honest, it does demonstrate kind of a severe lack of understanding, comprehension of African history, and of the history of not only Islam and how Islam spread, but also of Egypt as well. And even when the Muslims first came as well, there's mentioned some of the sources how, like, the patriarch Benjamin of Alexandria, that he actually welcomed the Muslims to come, because there were already internal disputes among the Coptic Christians and the Christians of the time within Egypt. They were oppressing each other. They were, there was things to do with, there was a lot of injustice among each other. So when the Muslims came, there were even narrations about how some of the Copts and some of the patriarchs were actually, praying for the Muslims to actually have, like, to defeat their other Christian counterparts in Cyrenaica and in Libya and so forth.
And so it's a lot more than is presented, almost a caricaturesque image of the raiding Arab conqueror, slave raiding, taking all these black Africans, and this Islam entered Africa. But as we know, in Eastern Africa, at least, it's very clear that there was definitely a state injunction from the Prophet ﷺ, which was maintained by the Khulafa al-Rashidun, and then even later down by the following dynasties, not to raid or invade on an offensive the Horn of Africa. But typically when you hear these statements that you've kind of alluded towards, which is effectively the slave raiding and the enforced imposition of Islam, we tend to think of Sudan as in the Western Sudan or the central part of Africa, mainland Africa. But it's a very evocative narrative, and the images are very evocative, and it is oftentimes utilized as a counterweight to the transatlantic slavery. So, well, the Arabs did it as well, and they did it before us. That's how Islam came to these lands anyway. Can you help us dispel a few of these myths?
It's worth quickly, briefly mentioning as well that you do find similar narratives in North Africa. There are some Amazigh who don't really want anything to do with Islam or anything to do with kind of Arabs or anything to do with Arabic. That's really strong in parts of North Africa as well. It has to be said. And it's interesting sometimes as well that sometimes the core arguments are the same, whether that's from maybe some of the Afrocentrics, whether that's from some of the Persian nationalists, whether we hear that from people that sort of the Hindu and Indian nationalists, or whether that's from the Amazigh nationalists. The kind of core thing is the same. Oh, we were forced. Islam came by force, and it over. So that kind of core thing I've noticed in some of my sort of historical studies of this it's very shared across the board. The whole focus is all against sort of like Islam, and it all came in by force. But yeah, so with regards to slavery, yeah, then yeah, I think it's important that that within Islam, that first of all, in Islam, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions how the virtue of freeing a slave, فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ, yeah, فَكُّ رَقَبَةٍ. All of this is all mentioned, the liberation of a slave, the freeing of a slave. This clearly emphasized as being meritorious act indeed within the Islamic tradition. And and in fact, the early Muslims, we find that some of the Sahaba, we know the Sahaba about and Sadiq Hassan Khan, he mentions this in one of his works about how just the sheer number of slaves who were freed by the Sahaba. So this shows that that Islam is not, and this is something as well which we find in the books as well in terms of slavery itself, that is something which the condition of slavery is not something which Islam is necessarily pleased with, but Islam came, when Islam arrived, slavery was already well instituted. Now, the system of slavery, was that something which was the same as the transatlantic slave system and some of the kind of abuses and the torments and the daily humiliation and the degradation on a day-to-day basis? Was it the same as that? I think it'd be safely said that in the Islamic realm, how slavery manifests itself was not the same. First of all, and we're not just gonna kind of, I think it's also important as well to say that the system of slavery, first of all, was not the same as the transatlantic slave system. There were very, and the key difference is that there were minimal routes to liberation in the transatlantic slave system. Minimal routes to slavery. And in fact, it wasn't something which the slave owners wanted in the transatlantic slave model. They want people to be free. In fact, it was the whole system was based upon the subjugation of African slaves in order for economic benefit and production on plantations. So that wasn't, they didn't want people. There wasn't, and it shows the difference between Islam and some of the other traditions. And that Islam, it does actually, there are avenues. There's things which are known as mukataba contract, where slave owners are encouraged to actually, and this is what the Sahaba they emphasize that this is what people who own slaves should work towards. Islam wasn't happy and pleased with kind of perpetual slavery or life, a life of slavery. Islam was not something which Islam was happy with it, particularly in the early generations as well. That wasn't something which Islam was happy with. Later on, we can get to where there are some very questionable, very
I was
questionable
waiting
things.
for that.
Ustad Ibrahim.
I was going to say there was certainly an incentive.
Very questionable things which happened later on within Islamic history, and this is important as well because not many of us as Muslims we're not really aware of some of these kind of abuses which happened in Islamic history. There are some reasons for this, which I think is key. As we're talking about history, very key. First thing, what I've noticed, Ustad Ibrahim, is in my study of history is that you can't just go to a particular country and say, oh yeah, but in this time of period 300 years ago, your people were involved in slavery. That's quite difficult because the modern nation states as we know them today were not in existence as they were as they were today 300 years ago. There've been modern borders. And in fact, I think colonialism has been key in that. That since colonialism, I'd say that there's been a kind of a complete kind of a complete severance from, you could say, like the sort of pre-modern sort of period of history. Complete severance of that kind of history. That's why you find in some parts of the Muslim world they have no comprehension, and it's not something which is taught in schools or even maybe in only among maybe specialist historians, but it's not something which in schools they're not learning about Barbary, the Barbary slave
trade, yes.
Like in parts of North Africa, they're not necessarily learning about that. Only specialist historians would know about that, or people who have some like strong kind of grounding in history would know about that. But it's not something which is like learned in schools. It's not something which is taught. And I think and colonialism led to kind of a complete kind of for some Muslim countries, complete kind of severance from the past, from the lands which they were in as well. So I think that's really key. It's not necessarily going to be the case that people are going to be aware of some of these things which happened in the past, but it's important for us to know as Muslims. Why? Because if we don't know about it, but if we're not the ones who kind of are the ones who kind of are discussing it and talking about it and also exposing it, then not only are we not going to learn from the past, but also we're leaving the door open for us to be really severely criticized.
But what would you say, Ustad, to those who say that this history is divisive? Is this potentially harmful for the global state of the Muslims today, for their unity? And we have other priorities that should actually occupy our time, not talking about the past.
It came up when I had this radio discussion, is that there was this notion that, Muslim countries need to apologize for Barbary coast slavery. There's issue with that. First of all, is that who's going to apologize for that? Because the kingdoms or the entities who ruled those regions now were not the same entities who ruled them then. There are probably 5 or 6 instances in history in the history of the Muslim lands which are really questionable and were really kind of abuses of not only the Sharia. It was all based upon greed and their own rapacious tendencies and so forth, and ignorance of Islam. But these things happen. Many of the Muslims of North Africa were involved in, and it's known as galley slavery. So it's essentially there was piracy where Muslims would kind of raid the coasts of southern Spain, southern Italy, and actually there's even evidence as well that it happened in Ireland as well.
I heard, yes.
They raid the coastlines, kind of take spoils, and goods and items and people as well.